Well, I want to thank you all for being here. You could be somewhere else tonight, but you decided to be with us, and for that, we're truly grateful. I also want to thank DU for allowing us to have the event here tonight, so let's give them a round of applause. So for those that are new, I also want to thank Philip Seawalt. Is he here by chance? He's the one that helped make this happen, so let's give him a round of applause too. So for those that are new to the Opportunity Coalition, why did we create it? For three simple reasons: to promote quality civil dialogue among diverse people, to build bridges of understanding and connection among people, and to learn from others. We have a business card draw. Did we collect business cards tonight or no? We didn't collect business cards, so forget about the business card draw. We're not going to do the business card draw. Next time we'll do that. I want to acknowledge our board members who are here with us this evening. On our advisory board, we have Kyle Henderson, Chief of Staff at North Star. Give him a round of applause. We have Millie Kitchen, Vice President at JP Morgan Chase. Millie. We have Rocio Perez, President and CEO of Eventiva Consulting, who's also an author, just blowing things up right now. Absolutely love it. Yeah, I listen to you. Mr. John Brackney, Director of Strategic Community at Webolutions. John. We have Scott Yenzer, Senior Vice President of Black Eagle Energy. Give him a round of applause. Is Mr. Brian Hart here tonight? Oh, there he is. Mr. Brian Hart, owner of Frame to Art. Love his work and everything he does. And Christina Whalen, retired mortgage executive. We got to change that title, Christina. I'll tell you. And then on the associate board, we have Abel Medrano, who's co-owner of High Rock Real Estate. Abel, there he is back there. And Lori Fisher, Community Relations for Comcast Enterprises. Give her a round of applause, too. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we're going to get right into it. And I'm going to share some stats as well about the Colorado education system. And if I get these stats wrong, I didn't share these with you before, so we got these online. So if they're wrong, work with us a little bit or correct us. I'm really pleased to have this distinguished panel. I've known a couple of them in different capacities over the years, and I just think they have a true heart for education in Colorado and are doing just amazing things. First, we have Luke Ragland, who's president of READYColorado. Luke has been an advocate for student-centered education systems for a long time. Prior to joining Ready, Luke served as Vice President of Policy at Colorado Succeeds, a coalition of business leaders focused on improving the state's education system. He's also a recovering attorney who practiced complex commercial litigation. Well, that's a separate therapy session for that a little later after the event. During a brief stint at the White House, Luke had the honor of writing political briefs for former President George W. Bush. He is the board chair for the Colorado Statewide Charter School Authorizer. He lives in Denver with his wife and daughter. Let's give him a round of applause. We have Tillie Elvrum, president of Colorado Coalition of Cyberschool Families. Tillie has worked to promote school choice in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Colorado, and on the national level since first becoming an advocate for school choice and education reform in 2004. She currently serves as president of the Colorado Coalition of Cyberschool Families and previously served as president of the National Coalition for Public School Options and on the boards of the Ohio Connections Academy and the Ohio Coalition for E-School Families. Tillie has two children, and Megan, a Penn State University graduate, and JD, a student at Pikes Peak Community College, and she resides with her husband Jerry in Colorado Springs. Let's give her a round of applause. And last, we have Ross Izard, who's the Director of Policy at ACE Scholarships. Ross has been at ACE, where he leads the organization's state and federal efforts in the realms of public policy and government affairs. He has worked at all levels of the public policy world, primarily in the realm of K-12 education. His professional experience includes policy research, design and analysis, legislative regulatory monitoring, review and drafting, strategy development, and strategic communications, and direct advocacy involving lawmakers and other elected officials. He has authored or co-authored many pieces on a variety of topics, including articles, policy briefs, issue papers, stories, and blogs. His editorials have been published by major national, state, and local media outlets. Let's give him a round of applause. Okay, so let me share some stats that we did some research on, and again, just sharing what we found online. In 2018-19 school year, the student enrollment in Colorado was about 911,000 students. The pupil-teacher ratio was about 17.3. The average per pupil funding, $8,100. $123. The number of teachers in Colorado is 59,989. The number of principals and assistant principals is 3,485. And the number of attendants, and assistant superintendents, et cetera, is about 540. Average per pupil funding climbed to $8,137 for the 2018-2019 school year. That amounts to about $475 more per student than the year before. It gave some districts additional millions to work with. But Colorado still lags most other states in per pupil spending, ranking number 39 according to Education Week. On average, per pupil funding in the U.S. is about $11,392. Here's some other stats on Colorado that I found interesting. We have 178 districts. 107 of the 178 meet the definition of small rural. 39 of the 178 meet the definition of rural. I grew up in a rural community in Olathe, Colorado. I know it meets that definition. And the average salary for teachers in 2018-2019 was interesting. Charter schools, on average, $42,190. Non-charter schools, $56,891. And for all schools, $54,950. Just some stats to consider. With that, I'd like to have each one of our panelists introduce themselves in a couple of minutes or less, and then we'll get into some questions that I'm going to ask, and it's going to be an open panel discussion. And then towards the end, we're going to open it up for group participation and questions. I'll repeat those questions just so we can get it recorded, and then they'll answer those accordingly. So with that, Luke, why don't we start with you and work down the way.
Great. I'll be quick so we can get to the fun stuff. Again, Luke Ragland, I'm the president of READYColorado. We're a center-right education advocacy group. We do everything from working to support education champions when election time comes, to lobbying the state legislature, to intervening in lawsuits and engaging in judicial activity, just all across the board, but with a one simple goal of making Colorado's education system much more student and family-centered is what we like to think our North Star. And for us, the way to get there is around two key pillars. One is school choice, and we're going to talk a lot about what that means. It's a loaded topic, means a lot of different things. And then number two is taxpayer accountability, making sure that tax dollars are being put to their highest and best use, but because it's not only good for taxpayers, but because that's what's good for children. Partner with a good group of folks here. Colorado's lucky to have a lot of education advocates, even though I'm sort of explicitly center-right conservative group. We have a lot of good education advocates who support those same things I support across the political spectrum, and I'm happy to talk about how the intersection of politics hits education, which I think is particularly relevant right now.
Tillie?
Tillie Elvrum, and yes, I'm with the Colorado Coalition of Cyberschool Families. I'm kind of the mom on the panel, and I'm often the mom or parent in policy discussions. I've been doing grassroots advocacy for almost 20 years, and it actually started, we lived in Pennsylvania, and we lived in a school district. My son, his first 3 years of public school were interrupted by teacher strikes. And I'm not talking about 1 or 2 days out of the classroom, but at one point they were out for 6 continuous weeks and didn't go back to the classroom until they were court-ordered by a judge. And so you can imagine over the course of 3 years the effect that had on the community and, most importantly, education. And I have a son who has a learning difference. And so his continuous education and the quality of it was very important to our family. So we researched options, and we researched every option. And at that time, brick and mortar charter schools were really only located in suburban areas. And we weren't sure if traditional homeschooling was for us. I'm not a teacher by trade. And there was one small parochial school. And because my son had a learning difference, we weren't sure if they had the resources that he needed. So we discovered something at the time called Cyberschools. And at that time, it was new and crazy, and nobody really understood what it was. But through all the research, it was the one moment in 3 years of real turmoil as a parent that I said, I think we can do this, and I think we found something that would make a difference for our son. And that's where my advocacy was born. And long story short, we used online education in 3 different states until we returned back here to our home state of Colorado. He graduated in May of 2015. And December, he graduates from Pikes Peak Community College, where he's been working full-time and going to school the last 4 years. And so for me, I'm agnostic to the choices that parents use for their children, but I firmly believe that parents are in the best position to decide where their children need to be to reach their full potential. And I just want to make sure they have every option available to them. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I just spent the last 4 years as the national president for the National Coalition for Public School Options and traveled across the country working with families that utilize school choice and learned a lot. I went really from grassroots where I was making my own T-shirts and my own press releases to testifying in legislatures all across the country. And it's been an amazing experience. And I'm really proud of the work that we do with families to empower them. And that's it.
Great. I always feel a strange compulsion to say amen after Tillie speaks. That's awesome. So, Ross Izard, I'm the National Director of Public Policy for ACE Scholarships. ACE is a nonprofit based here in Denver that gives out privately funded K-12 private school scholarships to low-income kiddos. So we have about 7,000 kids right now spread across roughly 700 private schools in 8 states. So it's a pretty big network. Since 2000, we've given out 35,000 scholarships worth a grand total of about $83 million, which is fantastic to be able to see the impact that that's having. I live sort of in a unique spot, not unlike where Luke is, where I've sort of come from a policy background where I was a professional nerd and spent a lot of time writing this stuff, doing research, actually being the wonk in the room, to now living a little bit more in the government affairs space where we handle all of the legislative work at the state level and the federal level that ACE gets involved in as we're in the pursuit of giving our families what they need, and sort of being able to see it from both sides, the policy side and the political side. More broadly, ACE is really, it stands for the position that every single kid deserves a quality education. And we don't get into the business necessarily of defining what that looks like. Every family is different. Every family is looking for something different. Our job is really to make sure that the door is open for them to be able to access what they need when they need it. So I know we're going to have a really good discussion about what choice means to different folks. I'm looking forward to that. I appreciate being here, especially with my colleagues and friends here in Colorado, and looking forward to chatting.
Great. So I know we have maybe some different varying views in the room, whether it be, public schools, private schools, faith-based schools, whatever it is your thing. But I think we all can agree that K-12 education is really important in Colorado. So I'm going to start off with a few questions, but just to set a baseline of some general understanding. So my first question is, what is the purpose of K-12 education, and what does a quality educational system mean to you? So Luke, you want to start, or you want to start with Luke, and we'll work that way?
I love the question about what it's for. And full disclosure, I don't believe that there is one single purpose, because I think it's uniquely personal. And I think that when people ask me that question, my belief is that K-12 education and education more broadly is about one thing, and it's about enabling each individual person to determine their own pathway, right? And if you think about what it takes for somebody to be able to really have true self-determination, it requires skills, it requires cultural competency, it requires acquisition of knowledge. I think that for me encapsulates the reality, which is that what education means to somebody and what its purpose is entirely personal and incredibly unique to each individual person. Now, we were talking earlier, and I want to totally own that I think that it's totally valid for somebody to say that education's purpose is maybe to protect our democracy, or to create civic citizens who are engaged and capable of continuing our country. I wouldn't quibble with that for a moment. Maybe it's to ensure that we have a high-quality workforce. Those are all really relevant things, but the fact that you're going to get so many different answers to that question, I think, gives us clues about what we should be doing to improve our system and to create the best and most high-performing system, which is really, for me, one that's based around individual choice and autonomy. Why, I guess, education? Was that your second point? We all have personal stories. I think that, I come from a fairly modest background. Nobody had ever went to college before. My grandparents were migrant farm workers. And I had a couple of teachers who really changed the trajectory of my life. I remember taking my grandparents into the Oval Office. Again, they bought their first suits ever that day to walk into the White House with me. That's an only in America kind of moment. And for me, that story starts with a only because of education. I'll give you a couple stats, though, because, we got some economics folks here. Every single year of schooling that you add is going to add, on average, 10% of earnings. It's like an almost ironclad sort of thing. We talk about income mobility between different brackets in society. We're really worried about that and stagnation in America. There are no silver bullets, but here's one that's pretty close. If you're a child born in poverty in America today, and you go on to get a 4-year college degree, there's a 90% chance that you'll never re-enter poverty in your lifetime, and neither will your children. That's pretty miraculous. And if we think about giving people the skills to move up and down the economic ladder, I think education's got to be a key component of that. So I'll pass it on. I'd love to hear answers because, as you can tell, I think that there's a lot of different answers to that question.
Do you need me to repeat the question, or
Sure.
Pretty good? Okay. So what is the purpose of K-12 education in your mind? And what does a quality education mean to you?
So I think I'm like Luke. I think it means many different things to many different people. For me as a parent, I think the ultimate goal of education is, my kid's not living in my basement when he's 40, right? And so, but ideally, we want to educate kids so that they're empowered to reach their full potential, whatever that looks like for them, whether it's career, college, the military, service, whatever that looks like for them. And that's why I think then when you start to talk about quality and what it looks like, again, quality for different families can look a little bit different. The way they evaluate quality of education is a little bit different. Obviously, we want our kids to be literate, and we have a true literacy crisis in this country right now. But we also have families that value safety for their children, and they know their children can't learn if they're being bullied or if they're facing some kind of mental health issue. And so quality, I think, that's a trickier subject. We all want high quality for our kids, but how we get there can look a little bit different for every family. But ultimately, what are we doing to empower these kids, like you said, to go and live their own path and be self-determined?
Ross?
Yeah, so broadly agree with both of those points, and I think I'll add to it. I've had the privilege of being involved in a whole lot of different reform conversations, often with Luke. And it's been interesting to track the quality conversation sort of as we've moved along, right? So we went from being really, really sure that it looked like this in terms of grade level proficiency to now we're really sure that it looks like being ready to go on to college or the career. Now we're getting more into, it probably is something that is more complicated than that. And I think one of the most humbling and the best experiences that I've had working in this world has been to get out and actually talk to families, particularly in the context of ACE, and really ask them every single year, hey, why do you pick schools? You don't care why I pick schools. I pick certain schools for my kids for my own reasons. Why do you do it? And all of the points that Tillie raised are there, and they're there in spades. And it's almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where they have to get through certain barriers before they can make a choice on something else. And so you find these really interesting sort of moral conundrums in there, where on the one hand, we talk a lot about academic performance, and certainly we can all agree that we want kids to be able to perform at grade level. We want them to be able to read and write, do math. But you get into a weird place where barring that, or creating a policy structure that creates a difficulty for folks to pick a school where maybe the child does about the same in math and very slightly worse in reading, but he doesn't have to worry about being stabbed or being bullied or dealing with drug trade in the school, Those are really interesting moral conversations that folks wrestle with on the ground every single day that I think the system is not set up with yet to wrangle with, but more and more, and the more that we get attuned to that, the more we're having real conversations about the fact that it's not just a squishy panel answer to say that there is no such thing as a single metric of quality that we can stick to. It really does mean something different to every single person. And I actually think I'd go a step further and say that it can be kind of dangerous for us to try to define it too tightly at the risk of creating a bad situation for somebody out there that we're not paying attention to. As far as the purpose of education, so I think, you could track this all the way back to the historical roots of public ed, which, as Luke alluded to, is really to create the next generation of virtuous citizens who could participate in American government, and I think that's certainly still part of it. I do think we've moved beyond that to something that looks more, self-determination is one way to put it. I think another way to say it is just creating a situation where kids can write their own success stories, however that looks, keeping in mind what they want to do, where they're coming from, what it looks like. For some of us, that might be starting a Fortune 500 company and being a CEO. For others, it might be working your way up to be a manager at a grease monkey and taking care of your family independently for the first time in generations. And I think as we've gotten to that place where it's no longer about the so what of education being education. How good are you at math? How good are you at reading? How good are you at this particular task that we're going to put in front of you? And really toward, are you able to build the life that you want for yourself using the incredible opportunities that we have here in the country? It's been a really eye-opening conversation for a lot of us, and it's something that I welcome and I'm excited about.
Great. Why don't we just move one over to Tillie? We don't have to keep going all the way back and forth. So a buzzword of today is choice. What does choice actually mean? Again, I just want to try to set that baseline so we're all on the same page.
So choice, it really is about empowering parents with the schools that they need for their kids to meet their individual needs. And so that choice, and we're lucky in Colorado, we're really blessed with robust school choice. And we were talking about it earlier, we have innovative policies here. We have open enrollment. So even if your traditional public school parent, they may think they're not a school choice parent, but they drive their kid to a neighboring district or across town to another school. They are utilizing choice. And so we're very blessed here. We have private schools, we have magnet schools, we have full-time online, we have blended learning and hybrid schools, and then, your traditional brick and mortar neighborhood schools. So we're really blessed with choice here. That's something I try to stress to our families. We have a whole generation of kids now in this state that have been choice products from kindergarten through 12th grade. And so their families, that's all they've ever known. Unfortunately, I go across the country to states that have very limited or no school choice opportunities. But that also doesn't mean that we don't have some room for improvement here in Colorado. I still think we have some room to grow our choice opportunities.
Okay. So Luke, you can either add on to that question or maybe tell us why we do have choice in Colorado and maybe other states don't have this thing called choice.
Yeah, I think the why choice more broadly is a great one, and I want to share the premises that I work off of because I believe that most of you will agree with me. How many people in here have kids? Just raise hands. And keep your hands up if you have more than one kid. Okay, so you have more than one child, right? And they've been through school, and of course those two or more children, they needed the exact same learning experience to be successful. Is that right? Right, of course not. Everybody shakes their head no. I asked that question sarcastically because I've asked that question to dozens of people. I've never heard anybody with more than one child say the answer is yes to that question. But I want to stop and really zoom in on what you just said because it's actually pretty profound and has huge implications for our education system. We've controlled for almost every possible demographic with your children. They live in they have the same parents. They have a lot of the same genes. They eat the same dinner at night, maybe most nights, maybe sometimes they're picky. They sleep under the same roof. Their parents have the same income. They're likely the same races. So what I'm trying to say is we have controlled for almost every possible demographic and societal factor for your children. And yet, even in that most controlled setting, your kids need different things. And so for me, I have to ask, what does that mean for our public and broader education system? To me, it means that I don't think we can assume that one school can be the very best school for every single kid. right? Because if kids need different things, then sometimes they're going to need good different schools. And that's not to mean that, Cherry Creek High School is an excellent school, but so it might be the best school for many kids, but it's not going to be the best school for every kid because kids need so many different things. So no one school can be the best school for every kid, but we have to have a system that serves every kid. You take those two premises together, and for me, it creates the why for choice. This is why we have to have school choice and why different options and different access points are so critical for families. And then, so we have to have different options to serve different kids. Then that begs the question, who's the best position to determine which kid goes to which school? And I think the answer there is clear that nobody knows. There's 1,000 variables for every single child, and those variables are changing. But the parents are going to know most of those. They're going to know better than almost anybody. So if you believe that there's no one school that's the best school for every kid, we have to serve every kid. We have to ask who has the most information to make that decision about where they go. I think that's parents. And when you add all that up, that's the answer for why I think school choice is important. So why does Colorado have more than others? I think it's, some bold policymakers that we've had bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats who've come together over many decades in Colorado to make conscious decisions to expand the options that are available to families. Let me put something on the table. Wealthy people are always going to have choice. Someday I'll be rich like Brian, and I'll be able to send my daughter to any school that I want to. But that's something, it's really a question about, is everybody else going to have choice? And Colorado has made some really bold and I think positive decisions, things like open enrollment. That passed in 1990, which allows you to attend a traditional public school, but one that's in a different district or outside your neighborhood. We have one of the most wide open enrollment laws in the country. Charter schools. These are public schools, but they're operated autonomously and given more freedoms about how they operate in different sort of curricular models. They're held to the same standards, but they're schools of choice, meaning people only go to them if they want to. We have private schools and organizations like ACE that, while there's no public support for these private school scholarships, the philanthropic communities come together to support those. And in other states, we haven't had some of those courageous leaders, some of those Romers, some of those Owens, some of those Considines, some of those Groffs, some of those folks. The students lag as a result. And we can talk about some of the outcomes, I think, that have resulted from Colorado's more open choice environment. But I think it's really political leadership at its core.
Ross, do you want to add on to either of those questions?
I might be the wet blanket guy that says that we do have a lot of choice in Colorado. It's great. It's a blessing. I use it for my own children. But there are a lot of buts attached to it for a lot of people, right? So, yes, you can open enroll into another school district or within your own school district if you'd like to go to a different school, if they have room for you and think that they can accommodate your child. Yes, you can go to an awesome charter school. My children go to a charter school down in Parker that we love. But there's very often a wait list, or you're going to be sitting in a lottery pool for a long time, literally waiting for a random number generator to spit out the lucky number that lets your child in. For some of us who, to Luke's point, have the ability to move to better school districts and decide where we want to live, where we want to buy property, where we'd like our children to go, maybe that's not a crisis. You can afford to wait a couple of years until you get into your dream school. If you're living in an urban core district that is having a lot of trouble producing the results that you want for your student, every single year is a year that you're not going to get back. Those children don't get another chance to do third grade, another chance to do fourth grade, and every year that they don't get what they need creates a compounding problem. So in some ways, we've been really blessed to have a state that has moved forward on the public school choice side of it. But I also think it's important to note that we're really far behind on the private school choice side of it. So we've got right now 18 states that have scholarship tax credit programs that incentivize private donors to give money toward scholarships like those that ACE provides for kiddos who maybe are looking for an alternative to the public system in a private school of any one of a dozen different varieties. Some places have full-blown voucher systems. I've had the distinction, or whatever word you want to apply to that, of working on the crazy V word in the world of education, which is a nice and contentious area to be. But there are now more than half the states in the country with some type of private school choice program on the books. Colorado doesn't have one, and these things have been around and operating in the country for more than 20 years now. So I think it's awesome to celebrate the choice that we do have, and I think that's really important. It's working for many thousands of people, but we can't let that celebration overshadow the folks who are not getting what they want and the folks who are still looking for something else. We have 2,500 kids on scholarship here in Colorado. That's fantastic. Every year we're having to turn around at least double that number of kids just because we don't have the resources to give them what they need. And that doesn't count the folks who aren't able to apply because we just shut down the application process. So there's a ton of need out there. I'm glad that we are where we are, but I also think that being complacent about it is a bad idea. We've got an awful lot more work to do to make sure kids are getting what they need.
Great. So for the next two questions, I'll just have it as open mic for whoever wants to take the question. We don't have to go down the line. How does Colorado compare nationally? What are we doing well, and what can we improve upon? Who wants to take that question?
I can go first. So if we're going to talk about it just in the strictest sense of private school, or public school performance, and Luke can speak to this too, just last week we had the latest version of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is called NAEP for short by those of us who live in the WOC universe. It's considered sort of the gold standard of how we assess how kids are doing. It's the same test given to a representative sample of folks across every single state in the country, which means that you can actually compare it plausibly between, say, Colorado and Mississippi, as opposed to, whenever you have individual state tests, it's really tough to make those comparisons because there are incentives for folks to game those systems and make themselves look better. From that perspective, in most areas, we tend to do better than the country in general, right? So we're outperforming the national public average. I think we have to be careful about how we interpret that. So on the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, when you actually sit down and you look at the national public average, you start to realize that that's not a tremendous accomplishment, right? So at ACE, we're working exclusively with kids who are free and reduced lunch, which means they're coming from low-income families that are making 185% of federal poverty or below. Those kids, according to NAEP, are about 2 in 10 proficient in both math and reading at both 4th and 8th grade. So if you walk into a school that serves predominantly FRL kids and you pull 10 low-income kids out of class and take a look at them, only 2 of those kids are going to be proficient in those subjects at any given time. And keep in mind, this is 4th grade reading, right? So this isn't like they're reading the Odyssey. They're sitting down and they can't read The Cat in the Hat. It's a big problem. And so I think in general, Colorado compares favorably to the national average, but whether or not we need to read into that everything's great and we ought to spend our time and efforts elsewhere, very likely not. And I'll pass it over.
Yeah, I'll just expand a little bit on that National Assessment of Educational Progress. Nerds like us every year, every 2 years the data comes out and we're just chomping at the bit to take a look at this. And so I crunched some numbers that I think are really interesting. Like Ross said, anywhere between sort of top 6 is the highest we get as a state to 15, 16 on 8th grade math. So okay. Well, what I thought was interesting, though, is I actually crunched the numbers on our public charter schools, which charter schools, again, public schools, held to all the same accountability standards, but are schools of choice. And they serve a higher percentage of minority children than traditional schools and a higher percentage of English language learning students than the traditional schools. If you look at how they compare to the rest of the 50 states, you see something really quite amazing, and that's that Colorado's 4th grade math students would be the best in their public charter schools, would be the best in the entire country. They beat out all other 50 states. Again, I want to point out that with a higher percentage of minority children and English language learners, they'd be second in 8th grade reading and second in 4th grade reading. They're top 5 in all metrics. That's a semi-miracle that's occurring. I mean, we are creating actually something that's a world-class education system writ large in the charter sector. And it's not a small group of people. There's over 125,000 students attending charter schools in Colorado. If you combine it, it would be the largest district in the state. And they're serving a really diverse population. So that's something that we should be really proud about and something that I think has a tremendous amount of success. So how we're doing across the country, it's a tough thing to answer. I think Ross's caution is a good one, though, that comparing ourselves simply to other states sometimes isn't so solid because some of the performance on critical things like being able to read is sometimes truly scarily low. I don't know, Tillie, if you have anything to add.
I was just going to add on kind of the political side of the education discussion, because we do have so many options for families and we are doing well comparably. We have a tendency to get complacent, and I think we should kind of be on alert, because what we've seen is in states across the country that have choice and innovation, what's happening politically is we're starting to see some pushback and some rolling back of things that we fought 25 years for families. And I think because families here haven't had some of the fights that have happened across the country, they take it for granted. And we know, we've seen bad legislation in California. Pennsylvania's got some really crazy stuff going on right now, and they get a little foothold, and then it starts to trickle out to the other states. And I think we have to be really careful about that. We cannot take for granted the systems that we have established here, because it can go away.
I'll say one final thing, Brian, on that is there's going to be some serious efforts in this upcoming legislative session to roll back charter schooling in Colorado. So that's not a hypothetical. I guarantee it's going to happen.
How much are we spending on education, and does money really matter in education?
I'll try to give some top line numbers there. We're spending about $13.5 billion annually on K-12 education in Colorado. I think the nationwide numbers are something like $600 billion. That averages out, Brian gave you the state sort of average funding, 8,000 something or other. If you include all sources of revenue, additional local taxes, you include local bond proceeds, you include federal monies and other grant monies, it's about $13,500 per pupil in Colorado. So it's a pretty good chunk of change. Does money matter? I think of course it does. Money absolutely matters in education, but it matters like anything in your life, how you spend it more than the total amount. I think that the idea that just simply adding more money is something that's fatally flawed. There's been a lot of research on this subject, and I'm not convinced that there's any sort of gold standard research that shows that blank check style spending into the education system that is going to result in improvements. And it doesn't also, adding more money to the system counterintuitively doesn't even solve some of the problems that you think it would solve. And I think one of the best examples on this is teacher pay. You'd think that if you added money to the education system, teachers would get paid more. I think that'd be a fair assumption. But the data is really clear that that is not what has been happening. Since 1990 in Colorado, we've increased our per pupil adjusted for inflation spending by 20%. During that same exact time period, teacher salaries are down 20%. We have a spending problem in education, but it's not in the total amount that we've put in. It's what we're doing with the money once it's there.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just reinforce what Luke said, which is that we have a tendency in the state, anytime we're talking about a tax increase or school funding of any kind. First of all, we should mention that we've been funding schools largely the same way since 1994, right? So we're 25 years into it. I don't know how many of you guys have spent time around American government, but you can make things really complicated in 25 years, right? So this thing has gotten very messy very quickly, and we have a tendency to only talk about 60% of the funding that's going into the system any given year through the total program, through the actual work that the legislature is doing. But like Luke said, that ignores local mill levy overrides, tax increases, bonds. It ignores federal money. It ignores big pots of state money that we're not paying attention to. And so the number that you sort of see in the headlines out there is very rarely the actual number. This $13,500 per child is more like it, and something that I think we could do a better job of talking about so that we're grounded in reality instead of rhetoric. As far as whether or not money matters, I agree the research is mixed and leaning very heavily toward the idea that just throwing money at things is not an effective strategy. I think that there are some really interesting anecdotes from other states where they've tried that. Kansas City is one of the best examples, where they have tried literally flooding an education system with as much money as they could possibly muster under a court order. It didn't turn out the way that they thought it would. It didn't move the needle at all. We can't say that it doesn't matter, right? I mean, we know that it costs money to educate a child. We know that it costs more money to educate a child who has a certain set of needs, who comes from a certain background. We can all agree on that. But I do think that the more that we shake out of funding a system the way that we phrased it, where we're just going to put money into this machine and hope that somewhere at the end of the machine we're going to produce the thing that we want, and instead really take a look out there and be humble enough to look at the way charter schools are doing business, the way private schools are doing business, and seeing how are we producing better results at, in general, lower levels of funding, and then retooling our system toward that so that we can really target the funding to kids and not to another assistant secretary to the under deputy secretary of the superintendent. I think that we'll have better luck doing that. And there's some move toward that on the local level. The state level work is still really focused on just throwing money at a fan and hoping that the right thing happens, I think we can safely say that it is not going to.
Okay. Are teachers underpaid?
Yeah, you heard me talk about that a little bit. I actually think the answer to that is yes, because if you think about what matters in an education system, it's teachers. So we're not putting nearly enough of our attention on teachers, and that's why I say they're underpaid. If you look at the amount of dollars that we spend as a percentage that actually are put toward instruction, which the vast majority of instructional costs are teacher salaries, it's only 54% of our education dollars, K-12 education dollars in Colorado, that actually make it to instruction. That's wild. We've actually crossed a Rubicon of sorts here where teachers are no longer the number one job in our K-12 education system. There are more non-teachers than teachers. And so it's not, whether the exact dollar amount that a teacher makes on average in Colorado is right or wrong for me, but I do think that we should reprioritize our system to put teachers, which are what really matters, at the top of our priority list. Cut back on a lot of other things that are really well-intentioned, and put that energy toward teachers. Here's an economic argument for this as well. If you took the bottom 5 to 8% of teachers as measured by value add, and you replace them with teachers who are in the top 5 to 8% of value added scores, so just basically like who are the best teachers, you take the bottom 5% of teachers, replace them with the top 5% of teachers, it would add, an economist at Stanford tried to quantify the difference that a high quality teacher makes to future earnings for children, like when they grow up and go out into the world. He found that this Stanford economist found that it would be worth over $400,000 for every year that teacher is in the classroom. Every classroom of kids that teacher taught would add $400,000 in present value to the nation's economy and to those children's earnings. If you think about what we did that, the numbers get farcical almost when you extrapolate that. And this isn't me just coming up with weird numbers. This is a guy from Stanford. It's like $100 trillion, over the lifetime of an individual, or if you did that over the lifetime of an entire body of students. It's incredible what could happen if we really prioritize teachers. So are teachers underpaid? It's a dang good question. I think it's a relevant one, but I think it's a matter of priority more than amount.
Okay. Anyone else want to take that?
Yeah, so I'm going to be saying I agree with Luke a lot, I think, tonight. But I think that a couple things. So the first one is that we could do a better job of targeting the resources to teachers. The other part, though, is that there are some really interesting structural reasons that teachers are paid the way that they are, right? So when we talk about are teachers paid enough, it's always sort of probably not, but what do we mean by effective teachers, right? Most teachers in the state are living under some type of collective bargaining agreement. With some exceptions, those tend to live with what they call steps and lanes salary schedules, where the only way for you to make more money is to spend more time in the system or to go back to school and get a certain number of credit hours of education, right? And there's a lot of really scary research about whether or not getting a degree in education makes you a better teacher. Spoiler alert, the answer is probably not. But that's the way that we pay them, and I think that came into being back in the 1950s as a way to start equalizing pay between female and male teachers at a time when that was a real problem. But even when we get into the idea of revenue at the state level and targeting down, getting it down to the teachers who need it, until we can get to a place where we can locally start looking at how we're paying teachers, why we're paying them that way, and then keeping in mind the fact that a really effective teacher has, number one, direct results on kids later on in life, but number two, there are back ends of that too, negative consequences. You know that every single high school kid who drops out is going to cost society somewhere around $1.2 billion over the course of his or her lifetime, right? So $1 million, excuse me. So by the time you get to the place where you're looking at those numbers and really thinking carefully about what it means to be an effective teacher and what does it mean to be in front of a classroom of kids, moving those kids forward, we've got to get away from the idea of paying them like it's still the 1950s according to a grid that was arbitrarily drawn out and get to a place where we're actually rewarding good performance and putting it out there, putting our money where our mouth is.
I was just going to say, Chicago just had a big teacher strike, and right, surprise. But I think I read something like 46% is going to pension and benefits, and that's another conversation that we're not having on how that affects budgets and how that affects actual teacher pay. And so all I know is for a parent, when I see a district that has a $2 million football stadium and then the teachers are complaining that they're not getting paid, it gets back to priorities, what's important. And so, and I'm all about technology, but did you need to buy every kid a new laptop? If you're, what's more important, the laptop or the teacher in front of the classroom? So it matters. It matters a lot.
Okay. If you were king or queen for a day, what change would you make within the K-12 education system to make the most positive impact? Tillie, you want to start with that?
I'll go since I have the microphone. I think if I was queen for a day, I think I would wish for some sort of backpack funding for families where their tax dollars, their education dollars that are allotted to them, that they have power over it so that they can really customize their education for their children, whether that means they put those dollars into their neighborhood school and supplement some kind of tutoring or occupational therapy or whatever they need for their student. Or is it they use a Cyberschool and then I can use whatever dollars I have left from my account to put my kid in the band in the local school district, whatever that is. I think for me, that would be my dream, to be able to really personalize the education for each of my children and to get them exactly what they need.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll take it one step further and say that I think I would blow up the concept of ownership in terms of money and education, right? So Tillie's touching on the how we get there, but I think a lot of the conversations we have are about, and you'll hear lots of verbs here, it's stealing or siphoning or rerouting or redirecting, whatever you want. All of them imply that there's some level of ownership over that money on the part of a system or a school or a district, whatever subunit you want to break it into. Taking that apart and reframing it so that folks own their children's education from the perspective of owning the resources that have been dedicated to it, not just in the form of carefully controlled backpack funding, which I think would be a massive step, but really truly changing the conversation to a place where folks know that the money that is allocated to them belongs to them to chart the course that their children need, and they get to make those choices. There's a lot to unpack in there. It would involve rewriting school finance. It would involve opening up the doors to let 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of which schools you could choose. But being able to shift that concept of ownership away from systems toward families and then building a policy framework around that idea and that concept is sort of my dream world. And if I were king for a day, which would be a really terrifying prospect.
Yeah, one thing you can do.
Yeah, don't ever do that. But that's where I would go in the realm of education.
Interesting. Luke, you want to touch on that one?
Yeah, it's a little bit boring. I would say something along the lines of what they said. I think I would create an education savings account that put differentiated amounts of money based on individual student needs and demographics that parents controlled, full stop. And then let that bottom-up pressure transform the system, because we've tried for so many decades top-down style reforms to improve our schools, and they're all well-intentioned. I don't believe that anybody was doing anything to try to hurt our schools, but we've tried forever to try to force people to do things differently. Try harder, teach longer, teach harder, teach better, and it just doesn't work. And I think that the problem with that model and why it hasn't resulted in transformative change is that the arrow of control is pointing down and needs to point up. And I would argue that putting money into an account that parents had full and utter control over for educational expenses would create bottom-up pressure that would transform the education system in ways that we probably truly couldn't comprehend.
Great. I'm going to ask 3 more questions, and we're going to open it up to the group. What states or other areas are doing a good job, in your mind, in the realm of education? Luke, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Both of these folks actually probably have better answers than me, so I'll be really quick. I love what's happening in Florida. They just expanded their private school choice program. They have a robust charter sector. They have some open enrollment. I actually think Colorado's open enrollment is better. But the results are there. We talked about the National Assessment for Educational Progress. 30 years ago, Florida was a terrible performing school system. And they went through this transformation that's focused around choice and empowering parents. And when you adjust for demographics on NAEP, which the Urban Institute does, it's a wonderful website. You can just search NAEP, adjusted for demographics. Florida really, really shines. When you try to compare apples to apples, peer groups versus peer groups, Florida's educational system is an unabashed success, and I don't think anybody could argue that it hasn't been.
Yeah, I'll agree on Florida. I pretty much go across the country and say, why can't you be like Florida? And it's because and Ross can talk to this more, but they have some really innovative private scholarships for families. And one of the recent ones was the Hope Scholarship, and that was for kids that were bullied in their traditional schools, and it gives them the ability to either transfer out of district or to go to a private school where they can really learn in a safe environment. And I think the other cool thing, it's really bipartisan there. Their legislature, their Democrats have even come out and said, we're about choice for families. And, there's always politics involved, but I know as an advocate, I can go there and talk to a lot of Democrats the same way I would talk to a Republican legislature and get the same positive experience as a parent asking for more options for families.
Yeah, every time we say Florida, there's actually a choir that's supposed to come out and sing angelic music for us. But I'll say Florida, too. They're awesome. They are by far the best example in the country of a state that not only has moved good policy forward, but I think, to Tillie's point, broken down the cultural barriers to those conversations. So while we're all still down here scrabbling over sort of the basic political nuances of these things, they are moving beyond that to, okay, what's the next group of kids that we can help and how can we help them? So their scholarship tax credit program down there that does not include the new Hope Scholarship program serves over 100,000 kids every single year. So it's a very, very large program, by far the largest in the country. It's bringing in somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 billion a year. It is a lot of money, $700 million. I'm going to keep saying B in there instead of an M. But Florida is great for results. I will say, from a boldness perspective, I really like Louisiana. So ACE runs a scholarship tax credit program in Louisiana. I've gotten very intimately acquainted with that state. They have had a patchwork of successes. If you look at the NAEP numbers for Louisiana, they're not pretty, right? So there is a lot to do down there. But when you look at the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, you look at the recovery school district that they built down there, where they basically said, look, we didn't know how to blow this thing up, but somebody did it for us. Let's start over from the ground up and think about how this should look. The results that they posted off of that, it's since reverted back to something that looks like a centralized model. But for a number of years were the best results anybody had ever seen anywhere in the country. It was off the charts to actually look at what a reimagined education system would look like. On top of that, they've got a pretty robust private school choice system. They have several programs down there, some of which are better than others for a variety of reasons that I won't bore you with. But I think in terms of being able to push it to the next level of thinking about the next policies in an incredibly challenging environment, the southern U.S. is a really, really tough place educationally. Louisiana deserves a shout out for that. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn there, even from the places where it maybe hasn't panned out the way that we had hoped that it would.
So I'm going to finish up with two questions, one of which is just for Tillie, though. Are cyber schools a form of homeschooling?
So I always say we're public school at home, but there is a difference. So cyber schools are public schools. They're funded just like any other traditional public school here in the state. The only difference is our kids do their school wherever they have Wi-Fi. So it might be at home or at the local library or, wherever they can get a connection, they do school. My kid did school from the Outer Banks to the Olympic Peninsula and everywhere in between. Traditional homeschooling, those families that typically choose it, they really don't want the government involved in their kids' education, and so they very purposely choose not to use cyber schools. But we have seen many traditional public school families make the switch to cyber schools because, one, they don't have to think about what curriculum am I going to buy, and they're expensive. Homeschool curriculums are expensive. And also the fact that cyber schools, we have teachers, we have certified teachers, and so that takes a big load off the weight for parents.
Right. So my last question, Do you think that the federal government should be more involved in the education system or less? Who wants to take that one? Just kind of a throw it out
Yeah,
there.
this is an easy one. I would say dramatically less. Not because people aren't trying, not because Betsy DeVos doesn't want to do good things, or Arnie Duncan before her wanted to do good things. I just think that there's a fundamental problem, and that the problem about what each individual child needs to succeed is something that's unknowable. It's unknowable by people at the state level, and it's unknowable, really, really unknowable by people at the federal level. They simply can't identify the problems that need to be solved, and so asking them to solve it is setting them up for failure. And I think, if you look at the federal involvement in education, it's hard to find really any bright spots, so significantly less.
Anyone else want to add to that?
How do you know that? No is the short answer. We shouldn't have them more involved. But I will say this. So I think that they, and I'll get to the why in a second, but I do think that the U.S. Department of Education plays an important role with things like NAEP, right? So from a perspective of being an outside observer, somebody who can come in and do something that approximates neutral research that we can look at and use as a baseline, I think they add value there. I use their stuff. I know these guys use their stuff. It is very helpful from that perspective. And really, they're the only ones with the capacity and the funding to do that at any kind of serious scale on a year-after-year basis. So there is some value there. But from the perspective of whether or not they should be involved in policymaking, working at ACE and working across 8 states, it's been really, really humbling to see how different it is across every state. And it's not even just that they can't identify what the problems are, it's that they're not the same problems in different places, right? So there's never going to be a single solution that you can come up with at the federal level that's going to work here. And that's even assuming you can get through the political gridlock of trying to slam something through state legislatures, right? So federalism is a thing, and it is deliberately difficult for the federal government to do that. But in cases where they've tried, and Betsy DeVos's initiative is a good one, they will wind up watering it down to a place where it's not incredibly helpful to anybody. So I would love to see them take a step back. I like the research that they do. I appreciate the quantitative work that they do. But from the perspective of, do we want them more involved in actual policy making that's going to impact how schools operate in states, it would be really, really tough to build a compelling case that the answer to that should be yes.
Okay, great. Let's open up for questions in the group. What questions do you all have? Yep.
How important is change in technology in K through 12?
So how important is the change in technology in K-12 education?
I'll answer, and then you guys could chime in. But for what I've seen, my son utilized online education for 10 years. And to see the changes just in what we saw, but what's really kind of remarkable is we saw innovation out of full-time online education, and the technology that comes with that really kind of seep into our traditional public school system. I always, as a parent, I had the ability every single day to know what my child's grade was in every class. I could see what assignments were being graded. I could see progress throughout a course to know if he was on track to complete on time. I could always see all of his testing, not just standardized tests, but testing that's being done within the school. We see that now in our traditional schools. Your kids, your grandchildren, their parents are able to log in at night and look and see what their grades are to find out if they were actually in school. And that really kind of alleviated some of those gotcha moments that used to happen at parent-teacher conferences. We don't have those anymore because parents are enabled via the technology to know how their kids are doing at all times. And then just the way that it's opened up the world for our kids. Like I said, my kid did school all across the country, different time zones. He was able to log in and do classes with his peers. So we never had a snow day in 10 years. My son had to wait till his junior year of college to have an actual snow day, which was remarkable. And if you would ask him, the worst part about cyberschooling was he never had a snow day. But he always liked lunch, see? So there's trade-offs. So technology really does. It opens up things for kids, and it really is changing and innovating what we're seeing, all across the spectrum.
Okay. Anyone else want to touch on that, or just go out and get another question?
I'll throw in something. So I get really excited about technology. The individual level, I think, is incredible, the stories that you hear from families, but I get really excited about it from a systemic level. So I think the cool thing about technology in every area, some industries all across the business world, but in education too, is that it breaks everything, right? So all the stuff that we built, the accountability system, the school finance system, the way we even think about education and zoning and which kids go to which schools, it all breaks in a world of technology where kids can go and select not just a totally different school in an online capacity, but a different class. So maybe they want to take a math class here, but they'd like to take CTE classes, career technical education classes, in another district. Maybe there is a teacher shortage in a rural district that they could solve by putting those kids into a class virtually with the teacher in a different one. All of those things are good in their own right for the individual kid, but they also make us fundamentally rethink these really old and rickety systems that we've had for decades and look at it and say, well, okay, if the kid's going to 6 different schools to get what he needs, who owns the test scores? So who's in charge of that? And does our current accountability system account for it? The answer is no. Does our current school funding system allow us to do that? Can we fund kids in a way that lets them pick a course here and a course here and a course here and build their own menu? And the answer to that is no. And so to see people go out and start doing this thing, not just ask for permission to do it, but go do it and start building those systems, I think in the end may wind up being sort of the magic key that opens up the conversations that we ought to be having. So it's really, really exciting stuff.
Other questions? Yes, Lori. So what improvements have you seen for children living with disabilities in the state of Colorado in the educational system?
So I'll go first on this one. I hesitate to say this because I think that there are bright spots, but I'll say not many. I think it's an enormously challenging area, and I think that, number one, there are very rarely the resources available that folks need to do that right, and number two, I think that the process that parents have to go through to get the IEP, to prove which disability their child has, to build out a plan that's really going to work for them in a way that is effective. Those are some of the scariest stories that I've heard in education. I will say from a private education standpoint, some of my favorite schools are those that have sprung up to serve very particular special needs, right? So you have the Firefly schools that are serving kids with autism. You have Human X down south that's serving kids like that. The Havern School in Littleton that's doing that. And so I think there's a really interesting patchwork of schools that have sort of stepped in to fill that void. They live outside the public system. In some cases, districts are smart enough to go and contract with them to realize that those kids deserve something better and that they should be funding it. There was actually a U.S. Supreme Court case out of Douglas County that dealt with exactly that. So there are the beginnings of hope there in terms of opening up access for what kiddos need. But in terms of general across-the-board improvements and special needs, there haven't been many, unfortunately.
Anyone else want to touch on that one at all?
Well, and I'll just say on the Cyberschool side, it really does meet the needs of kids that are medically fragile or have behavior challenges, those kinds of things that a traditional classroom setting, it just can't meet their needs. And sometimes, it's really a safety or a health, life and death kind of issue. And so that's opened up education for those kids where they can still learn and be on track and learn at grade level, but do it in an environment that is safe and healthy for them. That's where I've seen some improvement. And as a parent of a kid with a learning difference, it really enabled me to give him the one-on-one attention that he needed, that he just could not get in a traditional setting.
Great. What are the questions? Abel, and then we'll get to Les.
So I've got a 6-month-old at home, right, and she's not in school yet. Start thinking about this in the future, and it's pretty terrifying every time I hear of another shooting in schools. And so, what is going on with security institutions, schools and business? That was the post today. So
Man, that's
Question is, Abel's a 6-month-old, and he's just wondering, as that child gets older, what's happening with security and protecting the kids when we put them into a school environment?
Yeah, so I'll touch on maybe the most practical side of it and what I see happening. School safety in terms of like physical security of the school, I think there's obviously strong attention on that in terms of state priorities. There's an interim committee this year that's working on bipartisan bills to create better sort of physical spaces. There's questions for me, this is just my opinion, that we might need to question whether on the physical safety component, whether schools are the right unit to be dealing with that. The people running our school districts are educators, and I wonder sometimes if they're the best positioned to create safe physical environments. So I would be interested in, I've had some early conversations talking with people about maybe getting folks who are actual experts in the physical security of schools in their hands as opposed to school districts. The other side of that coin that I, sort of personally believe is that just it seems like we have a crisis, a mental health / cultural crisis in America that is much harder to deal with. And I have a young daughter and another one on the way, actually on Friday, coming up. So we're getting really close. My wife's really happy that I'm here tonight. But I have zero answers for you on that second component. And I wish I had more, but I know there's a lot of people that care about it, but I don't know the answers. Maybe these two smart folks can help me.
We send each of you a thank you gift of food, so maybe give that to your wife then. So,
It's tough, but there's been a lot of my organization. We did polling. I think Walton's done polling on just like why parents choose which schools, and safety is one of the number one reasons. It's below like academic program and standardized test scores, but they're thinking about safety. So you're not the only parent thinking about that. And I know for our population of students, it's the number one reason. Oklahoma polled their online families, and it was the number one reason was safety and bullying for students.
okay. Ross, you want to touch on that one or no? It's up to you.
Yeah, sure. I'll throw something in. Yeah. So I guess, these guys have hit the big points. I will say this. I think I've got a 6-year-old at home and a 4-year-old, and actually another one. I don't think I've told these guys this yet, but a third one coming in May. But I don't know if I was supposed to say it. Anyway, as we're out going, yeah, good thing it's all recorded. That's good. So as we go out and look at schools, what's been really interesting, and I watch it both from the parent perspective of going out and finding the schools and evaluating them, and then also from the ACE perspective, it's kind of funny to watch the way the market, and maybe that's not the right word given the system that we have, but the way the market responds to the concerns about safety, right? So it used to be you'd walk in and they would talk to you about the culture of the school. They'd show you the artwork on the walls. They'd tell you about how the kids do in math and reading. Now when you go in, usually on those tours, the very first thing that they're going to sell you on is how strong their security doors are, the fact that they have bulletproof glass up front, the security systems they have in place, which in some ways, it's terrifying, right? When you're a parent, it's always kind of terrifying to hear the word bulletproof in the first 5 seconds you're inside of school. But in other ways, to me, is a signal that we're starting to respond to demand from parents, to Tillie's point, that they're really saying safety is important to us. This is what we want. And in a market that's increasingly driven by people making choices where that's becoming a really important thing, you're seeing folks who are willing, I think, to have hard conversations about what that looks like that they weren't really willing to have before. And so I think as that gets folded more into the decision-making process for families and for folks who are out looking for schools, I'm hoping that that'll drive a wider conversation, not just of who should do it, but what exactly we should be doing and what makes parents feel the most comfortable.
So as your host, I promised to get you out of here by 7 o'clock, but I said to Les we take his question, so let's finish up with Les's question.
The question is, the United States is 38th and 24th in math and science in 71 developed nations. And no one really talks about matching up the skill set, K through 12, which is 13 years, and then maybe another 4 years going through college, to end up with what we need in corporate America for the future. I presented a question to the people running for the school board of Jefferson County as far as what is the mission statement, and basically they were talking about student-teacher ratio. I went to our public school system back in the 60s. We didn't have calculators, we didn't have computers, and we had a 30-to-1 student ratio on average. And Brian was shocked this year, 17-to-1 student teacher. But they also have the skills of having computers and calculators and everything else. So
so they should be learning even more advanced. And the trouble I see is, as we look to the future with the Da Vinci Institute, and here at Denver University with the Pardee Institute, all the changes that these young adults will have to make to have a skill set that will match the jobs of the future, that they have to be, they're not integrating what we need as corporate America and the world needs, based upon the education you're giving K through 12, to match up that skill set. And if it's math and science that we're still lacking in and going backwards, even though we had the old teaching methods in the 60s that were more effective to get the results that we need to have the jobs to match the skill set of the kids that you're putting in today to match up 20 years from now. Who is looking to the future?
So the question is, looking at the stats for America and where we are, what is being done within the educational system to give the skill sets for the corporate clients that are needing those jobs and skills?
Yeah, so I think Luke might be better positioned to answer it because of his time at Colorado Succeeds, who I know spent a lot of time thinking about this particular question. I think that there's some early recognition that the way that we've been approaching education, to your point, has not been necessarily what we need, right? So we're still thinking about it from the perspective of education itself being the so what, the way that we did 50, 60 years ago, instead of thinking about what these kids are going to need to be successful later. A couple reasons for it. One is that I think that there's been a little bit of a, because of some of the politics of education, a sort of icky for-profit business, don't touch education thing, as if those things are somehow not deeply interconnected in terms of workflow, labor forces, and people being developed that way. There are some really promising things happening. We were talking earlier about Warren Tech in Jefferson County, the Career and Technical Education Center up in St. Vrain that are starting to pay attention to preparing kids for the workforce. But I do think that there's a huge place for corporations, and particularly really skill-based corporations, to step in and say, look, this is what we really need, and this is what the model ought to look like if we're serious about producing high-functioning employees later on. There's a ton of room for that, both in the public system on the standard side and in terms of rethinking how we approach curriculum. In the charter space in particular, I think there are a lot of opportunities to get in with charter schools and help them build models that are designed to do exactly that. And I know that there are private schools like Arupe Jesuit here in Denver that are running really compelling work-study programs that are designed to get the kids not just the basic education they need, but put them out into the corporate universe and help them get exposed to that and start learning early what they need. So they're baby steps, and as far as your question of what we're doing, the answer is probably not nearly enough. But I think there are at least some glimmers of hope on the horizon there as folks start to pay attention to it. But I would say, as involved as folks like you can be in driving that conversation, the better off we're all going to be down the road.
Why don't we end there, because I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Help me thank Luke, Tillie, and Ross for everything. Okay, I also want to acknowledge Monique Olson. She shows up to every one of these events taking pictures and everything. Let's give her a round of applause. Monique is a rock star, and we're grateful. As we get to the end of the year, I'd love to hear any recommendations that you all have of what we should be tackling in 2020 as the Opportunity Coalition, whether we should go back to having individual speakers, or you like this kind of panel environment. We'll be meeting as a board to decide what's the best kind of rollout in 2020 and beyond. So if anyone has any thoughts or ideas, reach out to Kyle or myself. And our next event is going to be on transportation on Thursday, January 16th, and it's about issues and solutions for traffic congestion. So if you have any ideas for panelists that we should bring on board, please let us know, because we want to have a very interesting, engaging panel. I want to thank all of you again for being here, and thanks again for our panelists for participating. Thank you so much.